Welcome to the Dough Roller Money Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Berger. Today, in episode 327, I'm going to explain why I'm wearing this hat for those watching the video. And we might even talk about money. Actually, today we're going to talk about the 4% rule. We've talked about it in the past. I've had folks on the show from Vanguard to talk about it. It came up, well, and a reason I'll explain in a minute. But it occurred to me that there's a lot of misinformation about the 4% rule. I don't think folks truly understand many of the assumptions that underlie it. And I think it's important to understand that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get to it, the reason I'm wearing my Marine cap, is because if I didn't, I would look like this. Yeah, the hair kind of got out of control today. So I thought, what would be more or maybe less distracting? Me in a Marine cap or my hair? So the Marine hat won. And if you're listening to the podcast, all I can suggest is you go check out the video. So here's how this all came up. I know a lot of folks at Vanguard, and I see them at conferences, talk to them. Anyway, long story short, they invited me to write an article for the Vanguard blog. I go, oh, that sounds like fun. Sure. And I gave them several ideas, and we ended up picking one on what the topic was, what I call the 4% budget, which I'm going to talk about as part of this show. And so in writing that article, I did a lot of research. And through that research, it was clear to me that there's just a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation about the 4% rule, even from financial advisors. For example, in one well-known publication, they quote a financial advisor as saying, the problem with the 4% rule is that Benjamin, who was the author originally in 1994, his first paper that came out that discussed what we now know today as the 4% rule, failed to consider market fluctuation. Well, that's like the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Well, okay, that's not true. I've heard dumber things. But the entire paper is almost all about market fluctuation. That's really the whole analysis. If you read Benjamin's paper from 1994, that's about all he talks about is market fluctuation. And so, yeah, I addressed that in the article I wrote for Vanguard, which hasn't been published yet, but it'll be coming out at some point. I'll drop it in a link in the Facebook group when it does. So make sure you join the Facebook group if you aren't already a member, doughroller.net/Facebook group. But I thought I would use this opportunity in this show to kind of cover some issues with the 4% rule that I think are important for folks to understand, both when you're maybe perhaps many years from retirement, but you're planning. It'll be relevant for those in the FIRE community who want to retire early. And of course, for those that want to retire or at a more traditional age, or maybe even those of you that are already retired, because you're still, the decision on how much to take out of your retirement isn't a one-time decision. Even if you're following a rule, it's still a decision you make year in and year out. And I think understanding how the 4% rule works will be helpful to you. So that's what we're going to do today. I got about, checking my notes, I think 8 things to cover. So let's get to it. The first one is I want to make sure we understand how the 4% rule works. And again, the history was from an article in 1994. And if you're watching the video, you'll see the article on the screen by William Benjamin. And he did a bunch of analysis in the article. We're going to talk about some of it. But ultimately, his conclusion was if your number one goal is portfolio longevity, just kind of a fancy way of saying your goal is to die before you run out of money, then 4% is the most you should take out in year one. In year one of retirement. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about year 2? Well, this is what some people confuse. You do not take out 4% in year 2 or year 3 or year 30. You only take 4% out the first year. So then what do you take out the rest of the time? Well, whatever that amount happens to be, and we'll just assume you've got $1 million, so in year 1 you took out $40,000. In year 2, you would simply adjust the $40,000 for inflation. So if inflation happened to be 2% that year, you would increase the amount of your withdrawal by 2%. If maybe we had deflation, Not very common here in the US, but let's assume the prices went down by 1%. You would actually reduce what you took out in year 2 by 1%. But the key is you take out 4% in the first year, and then after that, you simply adjust the amount by the rate of inflation. The theory behind that is you maintain the purchasing power of the money you took out, right? So that's the idea behind the 4% rule. Now, a lot of people just stop there and they don't really think beyond that number. 4%, got it, adjust for inflation, good. I'm with you. Pretty simple. I could do that, right? But there's a lot more underlying this rule. So, number 2, he actually assumed a certain portfolio. If you think about it, I mean, what portfolio does it matter if you're 100% stocks, 100% bonds, something in between? Well, Benjamin actually made an assumption about that. He made 2 assumptions, actually, but we're going to talk about one right now and then another one in just a little bit. The main assumption, if portfolio longevity was your main goal, your portfolio should be 50-50. 50% stocks and 50% bonds. He assumed intermediate term bonds. So it was a 50-50 portfolio. That's pretty significant because, frankly, a lot of target date retirement funds, when you enter retirement, are much, much, much more conservative than that, even those at Vanguard. So you can't just assume that a target date retirement fund is the answer. You've got to actually look at how it's investing your money, what the allocation is. For the 4% rule to work, as Benjamin analyzed it, you needed a 50-50 portfolio. And in fact, he looked at portfolios that varied from this. And I'm actually going to pull up on the screen for those watching the video a chart that it's figure 2, by the way, for those keeping score at home, page 175. I think this was the Journal of Financial Planning where he published it, yes. Figure 2, and he looked at different withdrawal rates. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but he also looked at different allocations ranging from no stocks all the way up to 100% stocks. And at a 4% withdrawal rate, you did pretty well with a 50-50 portfolio. That was the main portfolio, and your money is pretty much, nothing's a sure thing in life, but you're going to last 30 years. You should, barring some truly extreme markets, and we'll talk about that. A 75% stock, 25% bond portfolio did almost as well when it came to longevity. It was a tad shorter, but pretty close. But everything else fell way off. If you had no stocks, if it was all bonds, I mean, that was like the worst. You lasted like, on average, like 17 years or thereabouts. I'm kind of just interpreting from the chart. 25% stocks was much, was a little better than that, but still much lower than a 50-50 portfolio. And all of you fans of 100% stock portfolios was lower too. It was not anywhere near the 50 and 75% portfolios. Now, let's stop and think about that for a moment. We know over time, even with bad markets, that a 100% stock portfolio probably does the best. By the way, there are some that might suggest a 90-10 portfolio. Actually, over many long periods of time might do better. But okay, whatever. Something very close to 100% stocks, when we look at the compound annual growth rate, the average return, it does certainly better than a 50-50 portfolio. So how is it that a 50-50 portfolio lasts longer? How can that make sense if its average return it's got to be lower, right? Well, you have to keep in mind that when people look at average returns over a long period of time, sort of the going in assumption is that you invest a lump sum at the beginning, and then, all right, what do you have at the end, right? What do you have 10, 20, 40 years later? What was the compound annual growth rate of a given portfolio? And again, the 50-50 portfolio, its compound annual growth rate over long periods of time, it's going to be lower than 100% stocks. The problem is, that's not what retirement looks like, right? You're taking money out. Every year you're taking money out. And therefore, the sequence of returns matters a lot, right? In other words, what years are good and what years are bad in relation to when you retired, right? And because, as we know, we can have really bad stock market years. 100% portfolio, 100% stock portfolio, while you're pulling money out every year, can clobber you if you do it if you get unlucky and retire at the wrong time. So I hope that made sense. We're actually going to come back to it a little bit in a minute, but the real takeaway is that his underlying portfolio that did the best in terms of longevity was 50-50. 50-50 stock bond portfolio. Number 3, he was looking at mainly actual returns. So he would set up, and he goes back to 1926. And he said, okay, let's assume that someone retires in 1926. How long will their money last? And of course, he has actual returns data, stock and bond returns data. And then he says, okay, well, what if someone retired in 1927 or 1928? And he kept doing the analysis year by year, and he goes all the way through to 1976. And for each one of these, he goes out up to 50 years. Does the portfolio last 50 years or not? Well, if you think about it, in 1976, if I'm doing my math right, 50 years hasn't happened yet, right? That would be 2026. So eventually, he had to use average returns when he got past the publication date of this article, which was 1994. But until then, he used actual returns. And then after that, I think he assumed, I think it's 10.3, I think, on the stock returns. Let me just double check. Yeah, 10.3 for stocks and 5.2 for bonds. And then he assumed a 3% rate of inflation. So he did that for any years after 1994 and after. But before that, he could use actual data. Now, here's the point I'm making. What haven't I mentioned? Fees. You know, that 1% or more that some people pay investment advisors to stick their money in for mutual funds, and the 1% or more expense ratios that those 4 mutual funds often charge you. He ain't accounting for that. So you're good if you're in a low-cost index fund and you're not paying some manager 1% of your wealth to stick your money in 4 or 5 mutual funds. And I think you probably can figure out from my tone what I think of that approach. But it's important. He's not assuming a bunch of fees in all of this. And that's not something to take lightly. If you take 1 or even 2% off of the returns that are used in this analysis, including the actual returns up to 1993, I guess, he published it in 94, the results are going to be dramatically different. So it's important to keep in mind the 4% rule isn't accounting for a bunch of fees that you pay some investment advisor who's written some book or something stupid like that. Okay, I guess writing a book isn't stupid. I wrote one, but whatever. I've really, over the last couple of weeks, through a bunch of analysis I've done and looking at different well-known financial people who I won't name, and I look at those that are investment advisors, I look at their fees, it makes me want to throw up. All right. No fees. Number 4, I mentioned longevity, right? So the idea initially for Benjamin was our goal is to make sure our money outlives us. We die before our money is gone. A portfolio longevity is sort of the fancy way to say it, right? Well, that's not always the only goal. Some people also want to accumulate some wealth to leave to their children or to charities or whatever. And what he found was that if that's also a goal, you're probably actually better off at 75% stocks. Yes, depending on when you retire, your portfolio longevity could be a little shorter, but on the whole, you're going to end up with a heck of a lot more wealth with a 75-25 portfolio. Now, what's interesting about that is really contrary to what you hear, in articles, with target date retirement funds, with analysis. How many people have you heard recommend 75-25 portfolio for people in retirement? But what Benjamin's analysis, and this is again, for the most part, up through 93, using actual returns data, he said is At 75-25, you take a little hit on longevity, but not much. And you end up, again, most of the time, accruing a heck of a lot more wealth that you can leave, again, to your heirs, to charities, whatever. So something to keep in mind if portfolio longevity isn't your only goal. Now, the next point, I guess, that I want to make, and it goes to this, what I alluded to earlier, someone saying that he didn't account for market fluctuation, which is just, I don't know how an investment advisor could conclude that unless he or she just never actually has read Benjamin's paper. But how could a reporter, where was the fact checking? This was a major publication. They put this in. Anyway, the whole article is about market fluctuation. But here's the point I want to make. Today, a lot of people will say the 4% rule is outdated. Why? Interest rates are low. They're at an all-time low, and that's true. We know that. And equity values are high. They've been going up and up and up. The PE is high. And so the 4% rule just doesn't apply in this crazy market. Well, they're wrong with a footnote. I'll give a footnote to them. Here's what I mean. When Benjamin did his analysis, remember, he started all the way back in 1926, and he was using actual market data. Can we think of any bad things that happened in the market anytime from 1926 up through the fall of 1994 when he published this paper? Anything come to mind? I don't know. The Great Depression, maybe? Yeah, he included that. He actually gave them, he's apparently an astronomy fan. So he gave these market catastrophes, I don't know, crashes. He gave them names, right? So he gave, let's see here. What do you call the Great Depression? So he called, So he called the early Depression years, including the stock market crash of 1929, the Little Dipper. Now, let's think about that. Shouldn't he have called that the Big Dipper? I don't know. It seems pretty big to me. I mean, the market crash was that October, I think, of 1929. I don't know. I wasn't alive then, but I kind of hear it was a big deal. He called it the Little Dipper. You know what the Big Dipper was? 37-41. Yeah, that actually was ugly. That's, of course, towards the end of the Great Depression and the beginning of World War II. That got the Big Dipper. But you know what? Those two weren't the worst. He actually gave one period of time the name the Big Bang, and it was 73-74. He called it the most devastating. And here's why. Yes, it was a recession, right? Yes, the market was ugly, but of course, same is true with 1929 and 37-41. But here's the difference with 73-74. Inflation was sky high. And so think about it. Let's say you got double-digit inflation. Not only is your retirement portfolio falling through the floor, you're increasing what you take out of your portfolio every year by 10%, 12%, right? For those of you old enough to remember 73-74, I remember it. Well, I kind of remember it. I was young-ish. But it was like a double whammy. Portfolio's going down and you're taking more and more out. And so the point is, he absolutely was factoring in market fluctuation. And all of these different portfolios with all these different retirement years, one after another, and he would go through up to 50 years, they all factored in all of these bad, ugly events. So the idea that we're going to have another one, and by the way, of course we are. I don't know when, but of course we're going to have another bad market event. We're going to have them repeatedly forever. But the fact that one is coming doesn't invalidate the 4% rule. The 4% rule factored in that very thing over and over again because it was using actual market data. Now, one could say, I get this, my spidey senses tell me that something bad is going to happen soon because equity values are high and eventually the Fed is going to start raising rates and interest rates are going to go up. And if I happen to retire right before a really bad market, that could hurt me. Absolutely true. In fact, when he looked at his 4% rule and you look at some of the The few times where it either doesn't quite get you there or it's really close, it's because of these events and timing. I mean, sequence of returns is absolutely an important factor, except that it's hard to control for it. I suppose you could say, well, Rob, I think the market's going to get bad here soon, so I'm going to work another 5 years. All right, I take no issue with that plan. I'm not arguing with you. But guess what? That plan would have made just as much sense 5 or even 10 years ago, right? I mean, we've been talking about this, low interest rates and high equity for a long time. I don't know when it's going to go bad again. I mean, as I record this podcast on January 31st, 2020, the market is having an ugly day, actually. Let me pull up my stock app. Yeah, the market, the Dow's down 1.76%, the S&P 1.5%. It's 2 in the afternoon. Anyway, I can't tell you when we're going to have the next big market blow up. It wouldn't surprise me if it's soon, but I could have said that 5 years ago. Yes, sequence of returns matter. And there is, by the way, something you can do about it. We're going to talk about that in a second. But this idea that the 4% rule is sort of outdated because of the low interest rates today and the high equity values, I think that folks that say that simply haven't studied the 4% rule in any detail. They don't understand how Benjamin came about, how this rule came about, the analysis that he did, because his analysis included some really dark times, no question about it. Again, sequence of returns matters, yes, but the rule absolutely accounts for ugly, ugly markets and ugly, ugly recessions and bad inflation and everything else. All right, 2 more things. I want to talk about my good friend Dave Ramsey. Well, he's not really my good friend. I've never met him. But for those that you know, he says the stock market's always returned 12%. It hasn't, but that's what he says. I think he's using a mathematical mean, which is by and large irrelevant. But I could be wrong. Maybe he's come up with it some other way. He also says because of that, you can withdraw 8% a year in retirement. Well, and he says a third thing. You should have a 100% stock portfolio. All right. Well, Benjamin actually, not because of Dave Ramsey, but he gave a bunch of different scenarios in his paper, and I'm going to pull this back up on the video. One of them was an 8% withdrawal rate with different portfolios, one of which being 100% stocks. And the average longevity of that portfolio was under 10 years. Basically, it's the equivalent of loading your gun and shooting yourself in the foot, and then reloading the gun and shooting yourself in the other foot. So if you don't want your portfolio to last very long, take out 8% and keep it all in, and what you have in your invested, keep it all in 100% stocks. I mean, it is just a recipe for disaster, according to Benjamin's analysis based on actual market data. I think that's enough said there. You can tell, by the way, I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, and I suppose I get a little frustrated, not with people with differences of opinion. I think that's great. But sometimes I wonder what opinions are based on. And is there real thought given to this stuff and real research? I don't know. Anyway, here's the last thing I want to mention on the 4% rule. And this is actually the focus of my article for Vanguard. It's what I call the 4% budget. In all of this, in Benjamin's paper and everything that we've talked about so far today, we assume what? We assume you take out 4% in year 1 of retirement, and then every year thereafter you adjust it for inflation. Well, what if you don't do that? What if you take out 4% the first year, but you adjust it for inflation every other year? So yeah, you're purchasing a little less, but you're able to manage and you're able to get by. How does that affect you? Or what if for a few years you reduce what you should take out following the 4% rule by 5%? Some small, relatively small amount. Well, it turns out that having the flexibility to take out less than what the 4% rule would dictate can go a long way to either building more wealth, if that's your goal, because you want to leave it to heirs or charity, or just surviving really bad markets. And so for that reason, I think it's important for you to think about when you're going to retire, what your 4% budget looks like. And here's what I mean. Imagine two people. One person, they both have 4%. They're going to follow the 4% rule. Let's just assume they both got $1 million. So they're both going to take out 40 grand in year one, and maybe they have Social Security as well. Maybe they have a pension, whatever. But one person, they need all 40,000. They come up short, man. They got trouble. They don't know how they're going to eat and feed their family, or pay the rent or the mortgage. I mean, they need every stinking dime of that 40 grand. And let's assume the other person following the same 4% rule, and they actually don't. They need 20,000 of it, let's say half of it, or maybe they need 30,000 of it, 75% of it, for necessities. But the rest is for travel and hobbies and things that are important to them, things that they want to do, things that are important to their quality of life, but not, survival. They don't need it to survive. If they had to do without that for a couple of years, they could. The difference between those two scenarios is really night and day. The person that's got the flexibility to take out less can handle, by the way, a sequence of returns risk where they retire and in year 3, the market just absolutely blows up. And they say, well, look, I don't want to cut back, but I will. I'll cut back for a couple of years, so I'm taking less out until things get better. That person will have a far greater likelihood of having a portfolio last through retirement than someone who's, nope, I can't. I got to take out that 4% adjusted for inflation every year. I don't have the flexibility. And so, a lot of that goes, I think, also to debt. I think it's one of the benefits of having zero debt when you retire. Debt, if it's a mortgage or whatever it might be, there's no options there. Well, I mean, there are, but there are no good options, right, to paying your monthly debt payment. And so that takes away a lot of your freedom. And so that's what I talk about in the Vanguard paper, that, rather than getting hung up on whether 4% is precisely the exact right number, I think it's a good number. Some, by the way, including Michael Kitces, has written a great article that says for most people following the 4% rule, they'll end up dying with a boatload of money. And that's true. The problem is that you won't know that when you start your retirement. You'll only know that when you finish your retirement. Right. But I think more important than debating is 4% the exact right number. Having a 4% budget that gives you as much flexibility as possible will go a long way to helping you survive and hopefully thrive in retirement. Then again, exactly the percentage. The percentage matters. I don't want to be dismissive of it, but having the flexibility to adjust your withdrawals in retirement can go a long, long way. And actually, Benjamin actually alludes to this in his paper and talks about the benefits of reducing what you take out of the market by even 5%. Can go a long way in increasing the amount of wealth you generate over your retirement. And I want to give you this is actually on page 178 of his article. He says, as an example, let's return to 1929 retiree, which, boy, that'd be a tough year to retire, right? He says, at the end of 1930, as he is about to make his second annual withdrawal, the market has already declined about 30% from the end of 1928. That's not fun. And there looks like more trouble ahead. If he reduces his 1930 withdrawal by only 5%, and continues to withdraw at this reduced level during retirement, by 1949, he will have 20% more wealth than he otherwise would have. After 30 years, he'll have 25% more wealth. So even making relatively small adjustments to what you take out in retirement, if you need to, and if the market's, if we have another 1929 in year 2 of your retirement, or year 1 of your retirement, even a relatively small adjustment to what you take out can go a long way to shoring up your portfolio in retirement. So that flexibility, I think, is really important. One last thing I want to mention before I bring this episode to a close is for you early retirees. One of the things he found, and I'm pulling up the chart now. Here it is. It's figure 1A, and then there's also figure 1B. So he went out up to 50 years. And at a 3% withdrawal rate, every portfolio lasted 50 years. and again, it's a 50-50 portfolio, starting in 1926 retirement and then working all the way through to someone retiring in 1976. No one outlived their money if we assume a 3% withdrawal rate. And that's even true, I think he said in the article, if you bump it up to about 3.5%. That's not true, by the way, at 4%. At 4%, a lot of the portfolios lasted 50 years. In fact, I would say, I'd say 2/3 of the portfolios, roughly, just looking at the chart, lasted 50 years. And most of the ones that didn't last that long did so because of that big bang, that 73, 74 huge inflation. But even there, they lasted 30 to 40 years, and in some cases more than 40 years. But the point is this: for those that are wanting to retire early, I'd probably assume a withdrawal rate of 3 to 3.5%, which of course means you need more money to retire, right? All other things being equal. Having said that, I've yet to meet someone who retires early, and by that I mean, say, before 50, whose plan is to never do another thing to earn a dime. Now, I'm sure they're out there. Maybe that's you. I've never met them. The folks that I know that are quote unquote retiring in their 30s and 40s are, they have some kind of interests, hobbies, and things that generate a little bit of money. But again, I think if you're thinking about early retirement, of course, that's it's kind of what my book's about. It is called Retire Before Mom and Dad. It's not really an early retirement book, but in any event, if that's your thinking, that's what you plan to do, you need to think 3 to 3.5% withdrawal rate. And I would probably be thinking somewhere in the 3.5% range if you're wanting to retire in your 50s even, just to be on the safe side. But again, even there, it also depends on how flexible you are in adjusting your withdrawals during retirement should you encounter a really ugly market, particularly in the first 5 or 10 years of retirement. Well, this is probably more than you ever wanted to know about the 4% rule, but I think I've exhausted everything I want to say. That's it. I actually find this stuff interesting. I may be the only one, but I hope it was helpful to you. If you have any questions, of course, dr@doorroller.net. Include the word podcast in that email, because that's the only way I'm going to get it. And I know I'm way behind on email, but that's just sort of like a constant state for me, but I'm working on it. And of course, join the Door Roller group, doorroller.net/Facebook group. And that's, continues to be a growing, vibrant group. You can ask your questions there. There've been a lot of great discussions. Well, listen, hope you have a great day. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.